Chris Hughes is a proven cloud cybersecurity leader with nearly 20 years of experience in the federal and commercial industries. Chris has a dynamic skill set with a blend of IT, cyber cloud security, and DevSecOps experience. He enjoys working across interdisciplinary teams to solve complex organizational and industry-wide problems to achieve technological transformation securely. Chris writes and speaks extensively about cybersecurity under the heading Resilient Cyber. Chris joins us to discuss software transparency in a supply chain context. We cover the role of threat modeling in the supply chain, the significance of SBOM, and AI's impact on the supply chain landscape. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Chris Hughes.
None of the top 50 university programs teach secure coding in their curriculum. At Security Journey, we help enterprises reduce vulnerabilities through application security education for developers and everyone in the SDLC. With over 400 up-to-date lessons created by industry-leading security experts and a programmatic approach that creates security champions, our program has increased AppSec knowledge as much as 85%. Visit securityjourney.com to try our training today.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo, CEO of Davici, also general partner at Kerr Ventures and AppSec aficionado. I don't know. I'm into adding names to things that people are doing now, but joined by Robert Hurlbut, my longtime co-host on the podcast here. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, Robert Hurlbut, and I'm a principal application security architect and threat modeling lead at Aquia. And really excited about interviewing our guest, very familiar to me, and been trying to get him on the podcast for a while. So really glad to see Chris here, another Chris, yeah. Chris Hughes.
Yeah, without further ado, so Chris Hughes is our guest today. And Chris, as you know, we like to dive right into security origin story. Take us through how you got to AppSec, how you got to security. I know you do a lot of things outside of AppSec too, but just kind of take us from the early days and bring us forward.
Yeah, definitely. I got my start, obviously like many in their career field, tinkering with computers as a teenager and stuff like that, but ultimately joined the military and served in the U.S. Air Force, where I did everything from starting on the help desk to advancing to network and system administration over to cybersecurity, because I was fascinated with the security side of things. And then got out from there and worked as a federal civilian a couple of times with the Navy doing cloud and DevSecOps over there. And then also working with an agency known as the General Services Administration, which runs FedRAMP, if anyone's ever heard of FedRAMP. So reviewing a lot of the cloud services coming to the federal marketplace. And then ultimately ended up co-founding a company named Aquia, where I serve now as the co-founder and president. And yeah, just pretty involved and engaged in the community in terms of writing and speaking, whether blogs, articles, books, podcasts, webinars. I host a podcast of my own called Resilient Cyber, and just have been really fascinated in everything around application security, software supply chain security, especially as we've seen these topics evolve over the last several years with the push for DevSecOps and adopting agile methodologies, and now the software supply chain attack accelerations, whether it's proprietary software, open source software, cloud service providers, managed service providers, and everything in between. So I'm excited to be here and chat with you guys.
Yeah, and you're co-author of the latest book you did, Software Transparency, Tony Turner, who was a guest on the podcast a couple of months ago. So we got a chance to meet Tony, and I think the book had not yet come out at that point. And so we were waiting to talk about it. I was specifically waiting to talk about kind of some of the details in the book. And so that's the genesis of some of the questions we have today are things that I was scanning the book and said, I want to learn more about this and about Chris's thoughts and these different areas. So yeah, Robert, where do we start here? What do you think?
Yeah, so we got a few questions to ask today. Let's start with, first of all, how would you define software transparency in the supply chain context? And what are the tangible benefits of achieving full software transparency for an organization?
Yeah, one thing that I kind of went down the thought process with this when I was writing the book is we've seen things like the CIS critical security controls that have things like software asset inventory, listed for decades now, right? But when we look at the software supply chain, most organizations don't understand what software they're using, where it's coming from, what's inside of the software that they're using. whether you're talking about ingesting and using open source software components for internal development purposes, or consuming, proprietary software that overwhelmingly includes a lot of open source software as well. We're obviously consuming services from cloud service providers. We have managed service providers using software. So software transparency to me is kind of looking at that broader enterprise environment for an organization, for example, and understanding who are all of our suppliers, what's in the software that we're consuming, whether we're developing it organically in-house, first party code, third party code, and consuming it from third-party, COTS providers, for example, as well, commercial off-the-shelf software suppliers. Because we've seen like this increasingly, it kind of reminds me of parallels to globalization in the sense that we're consuming all these goods and services from all over the place, but we really have no insight into where it's coming from, who touched it, what they did to it, how it was created, what maybe nefarious activities were done along the way before it got to us, and anything in between there. So I think software transparency is just like an organization taking a step back and looking at that, looking at all the software they consume and use, and understanding, where it's coming from, what's been done to it, what's inside of it, et cetera.
So given that the book is software transparency and it's going to have a software bent, from your perspective, what's the role of hardware though? Like, do we even have to care about hardware anymore? Like in the context of the things that we build? Like, because I remember the old days where when you studied supply chain, you would say, hey, there's threats to the hardware in production, and meaning production being built, hardware being built, components being snuck in. But now in the age of cloud, things are so logically allocated and whatnot. It's like, I don't even know if there is a server. There's got to be a server underneath this thing, but I don't know what it is. But so what are your thoughts on hardware in this world as well?
Yeah, I think it's most definitely part of the supply chain. I don't want to call it software supply chain, but obviously there's a lot of things like firmware and other aspects of hardware that come into play, from a software perspective. We just saw a publication, I think it was from NSA and CISA, about, I think it was Chinese malicious actors that were kind of embedding themselves in all these networking devices around the world and monitor communications, and then I've seen other folks like Tom Pace of NetRise, for example, say he's sitting on millions of vulnerabilities that don't have CVE identifiers in hardware and devices. So it definitely, still has a play. It's just, I've come up in a world where, I remember the days of running cable and stacking servers and doing things like that in the military. But, thankfully, I've been part of the evolution that's moved towards, declarative infrastructure as code and cloud native environments. And it is a little bit easier to discuss, the supply chain and the software context, where hardware, it's a whole other beast, and that's not my area of expertise, but I think it's definitely relevant, and it's still some significant serious threats when it comes to hardware as well.
Yeah, and I think it's going to become a bit of a forgotten angle of this. And, I love making predictions because no one can hold you to them. They have to come back 5 years later and say, oh, he was wrong or he was right. But when you think about...
I was just going to add real quick on that. You think about the fact that, like I talked about globalization, same thing in the sense of manufacturing. We don't natively produce a lot of things here in the United States, whether you're talking chips and hardware and physical assets and things like that. You need to be concerned about where it came from, who touched it along the way, and what may have been done to it before you got it. So it's definitely a major concern, at least for me, I think it is.
Yeah. And I think it's going to become a bigger problem in the future here as we go forward. I think it will become potentially a forgotten angle, a forgotten threat vector, right? Because we just think of the cloud as somebody else's computer, but we never really worry about the fact that what they're doing with that computer, right? So there's some opportunities, and that's a nice transition into threat modeling of, thinking about those challenges that we might be struggling with. And so from your perspective, what do you see as the connection between threat modeling and supply chain?
Yeah, I mentioned this before we went on air, but a little shout out to OpenSSF, who published recently a notional kind of threat model of a software supply chain. And to me, I always kind of go back to the fundamental four questions, like, what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? Did we do a good job, et cetera? Is looking at, like, from an organizational perspective, your software supply chain, understanding, where are we getting things from? How do we ingest things? What kind of security processes and procedures do we have in place to implement rigor and governance around how we consume software, how we produce software, how we distribute software for a supplier? So doing that kind of threat modeling exercise is a critical piece of this activity in my mind, of just understanding how we even ingest, consume, distribute, et cetera, software is an activity I think every organization should be doing to really get a handle on where they stand.
And I think we've got a couple of different angles to threat modeling of the supply chain. One of the things I've been recommending to folks recently is do a threat model of your build pipeline. We know that there's been a number of different breaches in the past couple of years where attackers have used the build pipeline as a vehicle for chaos. So why are we not threat modeling the supply chain or the build pipeline as a component of the supply chain? And then the other piece that keeps hitting me, like making me think about how could we do this, is it seems like if we could introduce threat modeling to the open source world, like those that are building these packages and whatnot, like we could unlock a whole bunch of capability, because we know open source people are scrappy, they're smart, they build the things that drive, let's be honest, everything we do is pretty much driven by open source at this point. But imagine if we could get threat modeling to them, how that would impact the supply chain further down the field if we had them thinking through as they're building libraries and stuff. Just, I don't know, it's a dream of mine to see.
Yeah, I was going to jump in there real quick. A couple good points you make is like the build process and pipeline. We've seen OWASP, essentially, I know you're closely involved with that organization, adopt the CI/CD top 10. That's a great resource that we cover in the book for folks to take a look at. And malicious actors have realized if they can compromise that build process and pipeline and tools, now everything coming off of it could potentially be a downstream cascading impact across all the software consumers, whether internal to the organization or externally as customers and consumers of the software. And I like the idea of threat modeling to the open source software, contributor maintainer community. But I think it's an interesting kind of, I don't want to say ethical, but like philosophical discussion in the sense that, like, are they incentivized to take the time to do those activities, or are they just doing this on their own free time? And it's kind of like that age old debate of like how much time will they put into security. Some of them, I think it was Harvard and Linux Foundation, found that most open source software contributors describe security as kind of a dreadful, soul withering activity, I think is the term they use.
Yep.
So it's like, will they take the time to do those things? I sure hope so, but I know many of them, they may not be inclined to do those kind of things, obviously.
Yeah, that's always security and privacy. Not so much in the open source world, because they don't have data. Maybe they're processing data, but they don't have the data. But it's been a challenge for years of trying to infuse security into the open source world. And some of it has been the result of resources. Like I remember the days when OpenSSL was still running with like 2 people. There were 2 people that were creating this library, and the entire industry was building their technology products on top of it. And there were literally 2 people creating the library. And so, it's gotten better with them being, I think they were one of the initial cases of funding an open source project through foundations and contributions from those that are benefiting from it, which is kind of the model, which I think it's the only model that's going to work for these types of very crucial kind of pieces of software. Can you call OpenSSL critical infrastructure? Kind of feels like it is, because it is everywhere, right?
Right.
Yeah, there's actually discussion, going on in organizations like CISA and others, and some of the federal dialogue around critical infrastructure, and definitely a plug for an individual, a researcher named Chinmayi Sharma, whose research I cite, and she makes a case for open source software being a critical infrastructure, because and so pervasive across everything from industrial control systems, national security systems, our leisurely consumer goods. Like you said, it powers our modern digital society, but it also suffers, from economic issues in the sense of they call it like a tragedy of the commons, where people will continue to exhaust this resource. And if someone else is going to do it, why would they bother investing the time, money or resources to handle it if someone else is going to do it for them? And the problem is everyone's kind of taking that approach. And now it's, we have what we have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think of the cases of companies that have built, even in our security space, companies that have built on top of an open source project. And it's not the classic open source company model where you provide a great open source project and then you provide support to it. That's the business that goes with it, kind of the Red Hat model. It's, let's take this open source project and make our product kind of sit on top of it, which means we don't do much by way of innovation. We rely upon the open source project underneath. And so that's one of those challenges I think we got to solve. And I know OWASP is wrestling with it, and others in the industry are wrestling with how do we fund those projects that other people are building companies on top of. And I think at the end of the day, they need to fund it. Like if you're building a company on top of it, you have an obligation to support the thing underneath. Like it seems like that's just a classic business risk move. Like my risk is that this open source project goes away and then my company's gone. Well, I should probably fund it and make sure it doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, most definitely. And that comes back to like, things I was diving into with the book around licensing, for example. They may not feel inclined to have to contribute or be responsible for it if they think they can use the licensing to their advantage. But as you mentioned, if you build your entire business around this project, or capability or tool or whatever, and the open source software community dries up, well, now you have a real, business risk on your hands. And one thing I found fascinating when I was digging into this is like some of the metrics. I think it was 25% of all open source software projects have only one contributing maintainer, and like 94% have less than 10. So it's this massive ecosystem that we all rely on for our products and services, but it's maintained by this very small group of individuals, largely doing it on their own free will.
I mean, that's why when you think about one of the scariest software supply chain threats, it's the infiltrator. It's the person who spends 6 months, 12 months becoming part of that core team and then gaining their trust, all for a moment in the future where they can pull the trigger on putting some type of package or payload into the library and get it published. And there's the hidden, there's the dark, seedy underbelly of the software supply chain right in front of us. And I don't see a lot of people talking about that. I mean, Chris, do you see people, is that a threat that people are considering right now?
So that's captured in, there's some good resources out there. One plug I want to give is for CNCF's catalog of software supply chain attack types. You can go in there, and it's one of the ones that are cataloged there. But it's not one that I think people pay attention to. They pay attention to things like credential compromise of a maintainer or a contributor, for example. But if I'm a resource strapped, open source software project and I need additional help, and someone comes along, and seems capable and competent and willing to help, and they start helping, and then next thing you know, you kind of have an insider threat. And obviously these open source software projects don't have insider threat programs like large enterprise would. So I think it's definitely something to think about. And these malicious actors are nefarious and they're patient, especially APT type groups. They'll get in there and they'll, stay active for a long time and seem, legit. And then next thing you know, they make a malicious contribution and it could have a devastating impact downstream.
Yeah, we're talking about the funding of nation states. Right. They have time to put a resource. Mm-hmm. They have time to send a resource to college or university, get a CS degree, and then become a programmer full time, almost supporting an open source, a prominent open source project. Like they have the time to be able to pull that type of thing off. And there's a lot of challenges in the supply chain. So let me bounce this other crazy idea I've had, and I've been bouncing it off supply chain people that people that think about software supply chain a lot, just to see if there's any kind of if there's anything here, and then I'm hoping to encourage somebody else to go build it because I'm not the one to build it. But you think about the impact Let's Encrypt has had on the SSL/TLS certificate generation process. Like, who pays for a certificate anymore? I don't pay for any of them. I have multiple web properties and I don't pay for a certificate, and I haven't in 5-10 years or whatever. Since Let's Encrypt first came out, I was like, that's brilliant. It'll refresh every 60 days or 45 days or whatever. Why don't we have a Let's Encrypt version or a similar approach for open source packages, where it could be as easy as Let's Encrypt for every package maintainer, producer out there to sign their packages according to this kind of common infrastructure that we've had. So like, is somebody doing this already? Like, am I inventing something that's already come up that someone's already built for us? Or like, what are your thoughts? Like, or is that a viable approach?
Yeah, I think that, a couple things on that note is, one is we're seeing the federal government, and we talked a little bit about this off air, and I know we're going to dive into this some more, but the federal government talk about what role do they play? If we're talking about things being critical infrastructure or public good, for example, and I know organizations like the Atlantic Council have made some cases for the federal government to get more involved in terms of resources and investments. So maybe this is something they help fund, this kind of thing. And then there are some projects out there like Sigstore, which includes cosign. They're trying to make it easier for software developers to kind of sign, their activities and things like that to give some level of assurance and trust. But I think you're spot on. Like, we need to see something like this that can be widely accessible, easy to use, and easy for folks to adopt. That way they don't, feel it's too cumbersome, because it could be a massive contribution to the community.
I just need somebody else to build it now. It's always the key, right? It's like, I think we should really do this, but I'm not the one to do it. I'm just going to keep talking about it till somebody else is like, I have this good idea. And I'm going to be like, yeah, that's a really good idea. You should do that. 100%. I'm behind you.
That's how it starts, right? Though, get good ideas and somebody runs with it. So, Chris, this is a topic we've sort of covered different times here on the podcast. I know Chris Romeo here; this is one of his hot topics. But I'm going to ask you: can you elaborate on the significance of the software bill of materials, or SBOMs, and how do they enhance security integrity of software supply chains for business?
Yeah, so I've kind of been waiting for this one because I listened to your guys' show, and I know Chris is a big proponent of SBOMs. No, I say that jokingly. I've heard him kind of dive in on the topic with different guests, and for me, I don't think of SBOM as improving the integrity. I think of it addressing longstanding information asymmetries that have existed between software suppliers and software consumers to show them what's in the software that you're consuming, at least give that visibility or level of transparency. Like we see, I kind of find it ironic that we're seeing this widespread push for zero trust, right? No implicit trust, but we're supposed to implicitly trust software suppliers and consume the software they produce without really understanding what's inside of it. But that said, and I know Chris has made these points before, there's some major challenges to the practicality of it in terms of formatting, depth of the SBOM, tools to ingest, enrich, analyze, and report on the SBOMs. So as he talked about with previous guests, if you don't really have that in place, you're kind of just filing this in a cabinet somewhere and doing it as a compliance exercise, not really using it as a tool to actually drive down risk as an organization. But that's I think it's being pushed for as a means to address that lack of transparency, that lack of information that consumers have from software suppliers. And the last thing I'll say, is I think it's something where we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. Is the industry in the position right now to take advantage of SBOMs and really use them to the full potential of what some folks see them to be? I don't think so. But is the alternative of just kind of burying our head in the sand and keep consuming things without understanding what's inside of them a viable alternative? I also don't know that that's the right way to go either.
Yeah, and I'm a proponent of transparency. Like I honestly, I don't have any problem with the whole idea of SBOMs. It's really what's been bugging me for the last year or two is people are promoting this as the answer to all of our problems. And it's like, it's not the answer. It doesn't do anything. It's an information collector and that transparency is great if you can act upon it and generate business value from it. Like I think about companies like Cisco, where I used to work, that have tens of thousands of SKUs. And so for them to build an SBOM factory, it'd have to be a factory because there's so many moving pieces and parts and things. Like they would have to, it's a gigantic undertaking. It would cost them probably, my guess is tens of millions of dollars to implement it. And so I just want to see us get to the point where there is an easier way to derive value from it. And then I'll get behind it and I'll say, let's do it. Let's force everybody to do it. But that's where I think we're missing. I think we're missing the value. I think
this is a weird situation in the sense that, we're actually seeing kind of typically I've been around government and government tends to lag behind technology, right? And this is a weird case where regulation and requirements are ahead of where the industry is in terms of capabilities in some sense. People are being kind of forced in this direction to start producing and providing these artifacts, even though the people requesting have no real capability to ingest, reason about them, make sense about them, and use them to drive down risk to the organization. So I think you're spot on. And it could become an incredibly expensive endeavor, not really generating any real risk mitigation or risk reduction. But I do think, in the long run, that having that transparency is fundamental to, just trusting the broader software, the supply chain, software we consume and use.
Yeah. And I'm fine with the government even mandating it, right? Like I helped stand up Cisco's FIPS 140 program. For those people, so I'm realizing everybody on the line here, everybody knows what I'm talking about. But for those people that don't know, FIPS 140, it's -3 is the standard now. It was -2 in those days. But NIST put together this document of requirements that describes how you create and generate products and services and things that do crypto correctly. And they came up with this standard of, and they do these really cool things like they generate algorithm testing. So when you're being certified, they send you a bunch of like encrypted data and they give you the key and then you have to generate, kind of the other side of the cryptographic equation to prove that your AIS implementation works. So I don't have a problem. So like I've watched the value of that. And at the end of the day, so a lot of people didn't like FIPS 140 and they said, this is just a compliance thing. It made sure you had to prove that crypto worked. And so the SBOM is in the same way. Like, even if we mandated it, it proves what stuff is in there. I just want to see action. I want to see people taking action before we force people, like big companies, to spend millions and millions of dollars to really get nothing other than another checkbox. Because, like, we know checkbox compliance, it just doesn't. If you're going to put the effort in, you might as well get some value out of it. That was always been my philosophy, even though I was around FIPS 140, Common Criteria, these types of certifications. I'm like, let's get some value out of it. Yes, we could just check the box, but let's make our product better at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a real risk. I feel like we deal with this dichotomy in cybersecurity often when we look at things like, SOC 2, FedRAMP, ISO, et cetera, like all these compliance certifications where organizations are still getting breached for lacking fundamental, security controls and capabilities, and as well as, how many times have we been through the security questionnaire exercise of, hey, send me this list of 372 questions. We're not even going to review the response. We're just going to tuck it away in a folder and say we asked it, from you. Is it really driving down risk, or is it just security theater?
I mean, it's, as the recipient of many of those in my first company's days, and it was so funny because, I would go through and have to answer these things, and then I get on a call and it's somebody who, and I'm not hating on anybody, don't get me wrong, but they graduated from college 2 years ago. They got 2 years experience under their belt, and they're kind of arguing with me about kind of architecture and things. And I'm like, I mean, I've been doing this a long time. You were in elementary school when I started doing this. And so I don't want to argue with you about the best practice of security, but I feel like I've been around a little bit. I feel like I've learned from people who, kind of expanded my mind. So, that's been a sore subject for me. But I know a lot of companies aren't started by security people. So they maybe aren't, everything I did from what we were building, I'm like, I was security first. Of course we're doing the right thing for security, because that's the only thing I can think of how to do it. I can't think of another way to do it. But
yeah. One thing I want to throw in there, I listened to a recent conversation, and you were talking about doing security, we're talking about kind of the distinction between real security versus compliance exercises here. But the reality is, for a lot of these, software startups and new companies like that, they're just focused on speed to market share, driving return on investment for investors. And the SOC 2, for example, could mean the difference between a sale or losing a potential lead, where, doing some of the more rigorous security activities that we hope to see, it's great from our perspective, but it's not really going to necessarily drive revenue for them. And that's why I think that we see people focus on compliance more than security in some cases.
Yeah. I mean, having gone through SOC 2, it's a minimum bar, right? But it's not a bad minimum bar. I don't dislike SOC 2 either. I see the value in raising the bar. And one of the things that we have an upcoming episode that's going to release soon was the minimum secure viable product. I always get that wrong. The guy from Google, Chris John Riley, who another Chris in security, but they've got this standard that, and I went through and read it before we did the interview with him, and I'm like, this is brilliant. They're not asking people to build a fortress of solitude to protect the data. But it's a solid set of requirements that you can build on that are more layered. You don't have to do everything, and that there's a minimum standard, but there are things you can do to exceed. And that's the key in the startup game, because you don't have all the funds in the world to build the most secure possible thing that you could do. You want to do the best you can.
Yeah, one thing I want to throw back at you guys, I know you guys are the podcast hosts here, but I like to ask questions too, is last week we saw NSA and CISA come out with their top 10 cybersecurity misconfiguration list, which I think you guys probably saw. Mm-hmm. And the whole security community just kind of collectively yawned at that. Everyone should be doing that. We all know that. That's basic. But those are still the most pervasive issues that are getting organizations in trouble and exploited. So it's weird that we have this situation where we all know what the basics are and what should be done, but they're almost never done, especially at scale in large, complex environments.
Yeah, that's the reality of the world that we live in, unfortunately. I've assessed different companies over the years, and you wish people would do kind of the basic things, but they don't. And that's why a thing like SOC 2 is so valuable, and it will counter a number of those misconfigurations that are included. And SOC 2's it's not as difficult to do anymore as it used to be, given you have a couple of vendors who will help you to put together your package of data and really drive it through. So, I think whenever I see one of those new lists and things, we've got way too many top 10 lists in our world. But it just continues to reinforce the fact that we're just not we're not even taking care of the simple things across the board. And, we just need to do better from that perspective. And somebody needs to push, or the market needs to push. I think over time, the market will start to push more, where people will not be able to ignore security and privacy, or that will result in their company just going away. We're just not there yet. So, all right, one more SBOM thing I want to throw at you, because I'm curious about your take on this. So I keep seeing new bomb standards come out. There is a SaaS bomb. There is a crypto bomb. We've had H bombs forever. That's what we used to do at Cisco. We had an H bomb for a product that was going down the line, like that told you all the components. But and I know I'm forgetting literally 100 of them, because there's all these other things. Like, is this generation of 12,000 different bombs, is this helpful? Or which would we be better served if we just focused on SBOM as the core and trying to get that squared away first?
Yeah, I got to answer this one carefully, because some of the folks that are involved in that, are folks like Steve Springett, who is he was a technical editor for the book, and I highly respect his opinion.
We love Steve here. He's been on the podcast a number of times before. Brilliant man. But I'm just asking the question. I'm just trying to understand, and Steve, don't get mad at Chris.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, these efforts are essentially trying to get at the same thing, which is transparency of X, whether it's an ML bomb or a crypto bomb or H bomb or SaaS bomb or S bomb, is really just trying to get to the transparency level of what is inside of the thing. And I think it's helpful to have that, but I think throwing the additional acronyms and things like that obviously makes it more confusing. I still meet people who don't know what an SBOM is, never heard of SPDX or Cyclone DX, or they don't understand the NTIA minimum elements for an SBOM. So I think as that kind of expands and the acronym soup grows, it definitely makes our case of educating the community on why we need these things and what they do a little bit more challenging, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about the kind of the government side, and then after that we'll go to the lightning round. But I know, since you're a lot more plugged into the U.S. government world than a lot of people that we talk to, and so how do you see the government's role evolving in software supply chain? Are there things that you kind of see that they're working on now that are going to pop in a couple of years? Like, what's your general take there?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty, I don't want to say unique situation, but you talked about, things will evolve, things will change, things will be, security will become a competitive advantage. You talked about, kind of in the sense that people will start to use it when they purchase products. But for a long time, people have considered cybersecurity to be a market failure, in the sense that it's not going to reconcile itself on its own. And I think we've seen the federal government, especially around software supply chain security, get it more involved, be a more active participant with things like the Cybersecurity Executive Order. There's various OMB memos that have come out now. If you're a software supplier selling to the federal government, you're going to start to have to self-attest to following NIST secure software development framework, or potentially, provide an SBOM, or, things of that nature, showing that you're following secure development practices. And I think what the government is trying to do is use that massive purchasing power that they have. They consume so many goods and services and spend tens of billions of dollars a year on software and technology, trying to use that to push that, systemic tide across the ecosystem and drive that, change that we hope to see, that in security we hope to see. And they've also been using a lot of language, especially CISA and others, around, pushing the onus on the individuals or entities in a position to do something about the software suppliers, the manufacturers, rather than, my grandma who just is using a router that she got from the ISP that services her at her home, and then we've seen efforts around labeling as well, cybersecurity labeling. If you talked about trying to provide, transparency to consumers, if you give an SBOM to the average person, they won't know the hell to do with it. But if you give them hey, this product is a C, well, maybe I'll go for the one that's a B or an A, trying to make informed purchasing decisions for consumers, for example. So I think the government's trying to step in there and change the tide of, moving towards more of a secure by default ecosystem, more transparency around things that we consume in software. Now that software drives, nearly every aspect of our society. But it's a difficult challenge because, you got to be careful what you wish for. The heavy-handed government can also stifle innovation and make things cumbersome and overly expensive. And so it's a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah, that's helpful to get your take though as an insider there. So, all right, Robert, it's time. You got to lead Chris into the lightning round here. So take it away.
All right. So we got a few questions that we ask each of our guests on the podcast. So the first one is a controversial take. What's your most controversial opinion on application security, and why do you hold that view?
I guess I'd say, and some may share this, I think many may share this, is we do a lot of complaining about developers and engineers, and people should do X, Y, and Z. But I think a lot of the problems we face in cybersecurity are kind of self-inflicted. We've heard a lot of DevSecOps and breaking down silos, but often we're making people's lives hell by putting massive vulnerabilities lists on them with no context, not really building rapport, overemphasizing the technology rather than the relationships, the trust, the dialogue, communication, things like that. So I think that in security, a lot of the problems we face are kind of self-inflicted, and maybe that be controversial for some in the security community.
Very cool. So a billboard, what would it say for a message if you can display a single message on a billboard at RSA or Black Hat conference?
Yeah, I was joking about this one because I talk a lot and write a lot. So to try to put it succinctly, I would put a billboard up that says people, process, technology in that order.
Cool.
What about governance?
Governance. We'll tack on governance.
Alyssa Miller was a guest on the podcast years ago, and she taught us that kind of concept because somehow I mentioned people, process, tools, and she's like, "Oh, wait a minute, people, process, tools, governance," and I'm like, "Ooh." So it's just stuck with me now that you mentioned that. Props to Alyssa for sharing that with me and Robert years and years ago. But it's a nice collector to bring those other things kind of together. And so, yeah.
And then final question is, what's your top book recommendation and why do you find it valuable? And I'm curious about this one because I know you are a big reader like all of us. So very curious.
Yeah, definitely a couple. I'm going to make two. We talked a lot about application security. So I'm a big fan of a book called Agile Application Security. And it's produced by 3 to 4 authors. I can't cite their names right now, but it's incredibly an awesome book about how to integrate security into Agile and DevSecOps and do it effectively. And then another little plug for Derek Fisher's Application Security Program Handbook. I thought that was a great book as well, and talks about some of the things that we just covered around, building relationships, vulnerability management, a lot of topics that we just discussed.
Yeah, those are two excellent ones for the library. Agile AppSec, it's been out for a number of years though, because I think it was Laura Bell and forgetting who the others, but I always remember Laura as kind of one of the primary authors of that. Yeah. And then Derek, Derek was a guest on the podcast here right after his book came out too. And so Chris didn't mention it, but I'm going to mention it here because I can. I'm one of the hosts. Chris and Tony's book is called Software Transparency, Supply Chain Security in an Era of a Software-Driven Society. It's available from Amazon, published by Wiley. So definitely is a solid one to add to your bookshelf and to read and really understand. Very, very in-depth approach to the problem. And we just scratched the surface here in this interview of the depth that's there. So, Chris, what about a key takeaway or a call to action for our audience?
This one, I'd say, one piece of advice I often give security peers is be empathetic. Go out and try to understand the incentives and things that people are doing and why they're doing them, what kind of things are driving them to do what they're doing. Because often it's simple for us to say, oh, you should be doing X or you should be. But we have to understand what their role is. How are they graded? How are they, their performance graded, for example? What's driving their behaviors? And building that empathy has gone a long way for me in my career. So I think just putting yourself in someone else's shoes can go a long way.
Very cool. Well, great, Chris, thanks for being a part of the podcast here and sharing your opinions, thoughts, and trying to change my mind on SBOM. That was a good take. Everybody has to spend some time trying to do that. But yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation and always appreciate being able to listen to you and hear you speak at conferences. And just always got great things to say, and you got things that challenge my thinking, which those are the only types of talks or things I listen to anymore, is people that are pushing the envelope with me. So we appreciate you and look forward to having you on again as a guest at some point in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show and look forward to continuing to tune in.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.